The desert sun had no mercy that morning when Jude Colter rode out to check his dying cattle. What he found instead would haunt him forever. A woman tied to a crude wooden cross, her dress torn, her lips cracked from thirst, left to die like some biblical warning in the New Mexico wasteland. Lenora Vale had been a mail-order bride, educated and strong-willed, until her intended husband decided she wasn't worth keeping. His twisted family branded her a witch and left her for the vultures. But Jude, a broken man carrying his own ghosts from the war, couldn't ride away. He cut her down, knowing it would mark him as surely as it had marked her. Sometimes salvation comes to those who least expect it, and sometimes the act of saving another soul saves your own. But would their mercy be enough when vengeance came calling? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The knife sliced clean through the rope, and she fell into his arms like a broken bird. Jude Colter had seen enough death in his 38 years to know when someone was dancing close to the edge of it. The woman, barely more than a girl, really, weighed nothing at all, her skin hot as forge iron under the merciless August sun. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and when he lifted her onto his horse, she didn't even stir. That was 3 days ago. Now she sat at his kitchen table, wrapped in his mother's old quilt, sipping water from a tin cup, with hands that still trembled. The bruises around her wrists had turned from purple to yellow-green, and the cuts on her face were beginning to heal. But her eyes, Lord, her eyes still held that hollow look of someone who'd stared death in the face and somehow lived to tell about it. "You don't have to tell me anything," Jude said, setting a bowl of thin soup before her. "Not until you're ready." She looked up at him then, and he saw intelligence there, sharp and clear as spring water. "My name is Lenora Vale," she said, her voice still hoarse from screaming, "and I was supposed to be married 3 weeks ago." Jude poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, his movements careful and deliberate. He'd learned patience in the war, learned that sometimes a man had to wait for the right moment to speak, to act, to breathe. Supposed to be, to a man, named Ezra Blackwood. He owns the Double B Ranch, about 20 miles southeast of here. She took another sip of water, and Jude noticed her hands were steadier now. "He paid my passage from St. Louis, along with the fee to the marriage broker. Everything proper and legal." Jude knew the name. Knew it like he knew the taste of dust and disappointment. Ezra Blackwood owned half the water rights in the territory, had his fingers in everything from cattle to politics. A man with that kind of power didn't usually have trouble finding a wife. "What happened?" Lenora's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "I wasn't what he expected. Too educated, he said, too opinionated. I could read and write better than his own son, and that didn't sit well with the family." She touched the fading bruise on her cheek. "His sister-in-law, Martha, she's got some peculiar ideas about women who know too much. Called me a witch, said I was trying to bewitch her brother with book learning and fancy words." The coffee turned to ash in Jude's mouth. He'd seen what happened to women who crossed the Blackwoods. Most times they just disappeared, moved on to other towns, other territories. But sometimes they didn't move on at all. They tied. "You to that cross?" Martha's idea, said it was a lesson for other women who might get above themselves. Lenora's voice grew stronger with each word, as if telling the story was somehow setting her free from it. "Left me there with a sign around my neck, witch and harlot. Figured the sun would do the rest." Jude set down his cup harder than he intended, and the sound rang through the small kitchen like a gunshot. Outside, his cattle lowed mournfully in the heat, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat these past 2 years of drought. His ranch was failing, had been failing since the day he'd bought it with his war pension and a pocketful of dreams. The well was running dry, the grass was burned to stubble, and he owed more money than he could pay in 3 lifetimes. But looking at this woman, this Lenora Vale, who'd been left to die for the crime of thinking too much, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried with the rest of his optimism. "You got anywhere to go?" he asked. She shook her head. My family back in Missouri. They disowned me when I decided to come west as a mail-order bride. Said it wasn't respectable. Her smile was rueful. Turned out they were right, just not in the way they expected. Jude stood and walked to the window that looked out over his struggling spread. The house was small but solid, built by the previous owner who'd given up and moved back east after losing 2 seasons of crops to drought. The barn needed work, the fences were falling down, and there wasn't a cow on the place that wasn't showing. Ribs, but it was his, bought and paid for with money earned in blood and powder smoke during 4 years of the ugliest war this continent had ever seen. In the corner of his bedroom, hidden in an old cigar box under a loose floorboard, was his medal from the war. The Congressional Medal of Honor, they'd called it, pinned on his chest by some general whose name he'd forgotten while photographers captured the moment for posterity. Jude never looked at it anymore, never touched it. It reminded him too much of the day he'd earned it, the day he'd saved 23 men from a Confederate ambush and lost his best friend doing it. Some hero. Couldn't even save his own ranch from dying of thirst. You can stay here, he said, not turning from the window. Long as you need to. I can work, Lenora said quickly. I'm not looking for charity. I can cook, clean, tend animals. I helped run my father's store back in St. Louis before everything went wrong. This isn't charity. Jude turned back to face her, and for the first time in months he felt something like hope stirring in his chest. This is 2 people helping each other survive. The woman who looked back at him wasn't the broken bird he'd cut down from that cross 3 days ago. This was someone with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes, someone who'd been knocked down but hadn't stayed down. Someone who might just understand what it meant to start over when the whole world seemed set against you. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds dancing across the yard. In the distance, thunder rumbled, promising rain that might never come. But for the first time since he'd bought this place, Jude Colter didn't feel quite so alone. That night, after Lenora had retired to the small bedroom he'd given her, his own room, while he made do with a bedroll by the fire, Jude sat on his porch and watched the stars wheel overhead. The desert night was cool after the blazing heat of the day, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate with a sound like loneliness given voice. He thought about the woman sleeping in his house, about the strength it must have, taken to survive, what she'd been through. He thought about Ezra Blackwood and his twisted family, about the kind of power that let a man destroy someone's life just because he could. And he thought about the medal hidden in his bedroom, about the weight of it and what it represented. Maybe it was time to remember what it meant to fight for something worth saving. Maybe it was time to stop running from the man he used to be and start figuring out who he could become. The wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of rain still hours away, and Jude Colter made himself a promise. Whatever came next, whatever the Blackwoods or the drought or his own failures threw at him, he wouldn't let this woman down. He'd already saved her life once. Now maybe she could help him save his own. The riders came at dawn, 6 of them in a line across the ridge like black marks against the red sky. Jude was already up, checking on the horses in the corral, when he spotted them. They sat their mounts easy, patient as buzzards, and he knew, without looking, that they wore the Double B brand on their leather vests. "Lenora," he called, not taking his eyes off the ridge. "Best come inside." She appeared in the doorway, still wearing the simple dress he'd bought her in town, the first new clothes she'd owned since leaving St. Louis. Her hair was pinned back neat and proper, but her eyes were sharp as she followed his gaze to the waiting riders. "They're here for me," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, only a kind of weary resignation. "Not necessarily." Jude walked back toward the house, moving slow and easy, his hand resting casual-like on the butt of his Colt. Could be they're just passing through, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Blackwood's men didn't just pass through anywhere. They came with purpose, and that purpose usually involved making someone's life considerably more difficult. Lead rider spurred his horse down the slope, and the others followed. Jude recognized the man, Tom Harwick, Blackwood's foreman, mean as a rattlesnake and twice as quick to strike. Behind him rode men Jude knew by reputation, hard cases who'd hire their guns to anyone willing to pay their price. "Morning, Colter," Harwick called out as they approached. He was a lean man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. "Fine day for a ride." "Morning, Tom." Jude stepped off the porch, putting himself between the riders and the house. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Business." Harwick's gaze shifted to the house where Lenora stood framed in the doorway. "Seems you got something that belongs to Mr. Blackwood." "Don't see how that's possible. Everything here belongs to me." Harwick's smile widened. "That woman there. She's got a legal contract with Mr. Blackwood, binding agreement. He paid good money for her, and she's got obligations to fulfill." Jude felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Woman's free to make her own choices, contract or no contract." "See, that's where you're wrong." One of the other riders, a thick-set man with a face like a clenched fist, spoke up. "Woman like that, she's got to honor her agreements. Otherwise, what's to stop any of them from running off the minute they get what they want?" "She didn't get what she wanted," Jude said quietly. "She got left to die. That's between her and Mr. Blackwood," Harwick said. "But the law's the law, and she's got a contract to fulfill." Lenora stepped forward then, and Jude heard the screen door bang shut behind her. "I fulfilled my part of the contract the moment I stepped off that stagecoach," she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard. "I came here in good faith, ready to be a wife to your employer. He's the one who decided I wasn't suitable." "You're suitable enough," the thick-set man said with a leer. "Just need to learn your place." Jude's hand moved to his gun, but Harwick held up a hand. Now, no need for unpleasantness. We're all civilized men here." He looked at Lenora with those cold eyes. "Ma'am, you got a choice to make. You can come with us peaceable-like, or we can come back with the sheriff and some proper legal papers." "The sheriff's in Blackwood's pocket," Lenora said. "We all know that." "Makes no difference," Harwick replied. "Law's the law, and the law says you belong to Mr. Blackwood until that contract's fulfilled." Jude stepped forward, his shadow falling, across Harwick's horse. "And what does the law say about leaving a woman tied to a cross to die?" For the first time, Harwick's smile faltered. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. Your boss's sister-in-law got some peculiar ideas about justice, decided to make an example of Miss Vale here." Jude's voice stayed level, but there was steel underneath it. "Now, I don't know what kind of contracts you folks are used to, but where I come from, trying to murder someone tends to void any legal agreements you might have had." "You got proof of that?" one of the other riders asked. Jude looked at Lenora. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring, the wedding band that had been meant for her finger, the one she'd never gotten to wear. The metal caught the morning light, and for a moment it seemed to burn like a small sun in her palm. "This was supposed to be mine," she said, "part of the contract, a symbol of the marriage we were both supposed to honor." She closed her fist around the ring. "Instead, your employer decided I wasn't good enough for his name, and his family decided I wasn't good enough to live." "That's a serious accusation," Harwick said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "It's the truth," Lenora replied, "and I'm willing to swear to it in front of any judge who isn't bought and paid for by Ezra Blackwood." The riders exchanged glances, and Jude could see the calculation in their eyes. They'd come expecting to intimidate a broken woman and a failing rancher. Instead, they'd found someone willing to fight back. "Tell you what," Harwick said finally. "I'll take your message back to Mr. Blackwood. Let him decide what he wants to do about it." He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, Colter." "Tom," Jude said, "you tell your boss something for me. Tell him this woman's under my protection now. Anyone wants to harm her, they'll have to come through me first." Harwick's smile returned, colder than before. "That a threat, Colter?" "It's a promise." The foreman studied Jude for a long moment, taking in the way he stood, the set of his shoulders, the easy confidence with which he wore his gun. Most men would have been intimidated by 6 armed riders. This one stood his ground like he'd done it before. "We'll be seeing you again," Harik said. "I expect you will." The riders wheeled their horses and rode back toward the ridge, but Jude noticed they didn't head straight back to the Double B. Instead, they turned toward town, toward the sheriff's office and the courthouse where Blackwood's influence ran. "Deepest. They'll be back," Lenora said, watching them disappear over the ridge. "I know." Jude turned to look at her, this woman who'd faced down 6 armed men without flinching. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" She opened her hand and looked down at the ring in her palm. "I'm going to fight," she said simply. "I'm tired of running, tired of letting other people decide what I'm worth." She looked up at him. "If you'll have me." Jude thought about the medal hidden in his bedroom, about the men he'd saved and the friend he'd lost. He thought about the ranch slowly dying around him and the debts that kept piling up like tumbleweeds against a fence. He thought about 6 riders carrying news back to one of the most powerful men in the territory and what that was likely to mean for both of them. "I'll have you," he said. "But you should know what you're getting into. Blackwood's got money, influence, men willing to do his dirty work. I've got a failing ranch and more enemies than friends." "You've got something else," Lenora said, slipping the ring back into her pocket. "You've got a conscience that's rarer than you might think." That afternoon, Jude rode into town to buy supplies and to take the temperature of the local sentiment. What he found wasn't encouraging. The general store owner, who'd always been friendly enough, suddenly had urgent business in the back room when Jude walked in. The banker, who'd extended his loan twice already, made it clear that patience was wearing thin. Even the preacher, who usually had a kind word for everyone, seemed to find the street particularly interesting when Jude passed by. Word had spread fast, as it always did in small towns. Jude Colter was harboring Ezra Blackwood's runaway bride, and that made him a marked man. In a territory where water rights and cattle were everything, crossing the wrong person could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. But it was the conversation he overheard at the saloon that told him just how deep the trouble ran. "Heard. You tell Blackwood's fit to be tied," one man was saying. "Spent good money bringing that woman out here, and now she's taken up with that broken-down rancher." "Coulter's got more guts than sense," another replied. "Man's already hanging by a thread financially. Last thing he needs is to make an enemy of the most powerful man in 3 counties. Maybe that's what he wants," a third voice suggested. "Maybe. He figures if he can't make it as a rancher, he'll make his mark some other way." Jude nursed his beer and listened, learning more about his situation than he'd known before. The general consensus seemed to be that he was either brave or foolish, and most folks weren't sure which. What was clear was that he'd crossed a line that most people wouldn't dare approach. When he rode back to the ranch that evening, he found Lenora waiting for him on the porch. She'd spent the day cleaning and organizing, and the place already looked more like a home than it had in months. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough." He sat down beside her, and they watched the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Town's choosing sides, and we're not winning." "I'm sorry," she said. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." "Trouble was already here," Jude replied, just wearing a different face. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the vast emptiness, carrying travelers to destinations unknown. "Jude," Lenora said finally, "what you did today, standing up to those men, it wasn't just about me, was it?" He considered the question, turning it over in his mind like a stone. "Maybe not," he admitted. "Maybe it was about finally deciding what kind of man I want to be. And what kind is that? The kind who doesn't walk away when someone needs help." He looked at her in the gathering darkness. "The kind who remembers that some things are worth fighting for." That night, as Lenora slept in his bedroom and he lay on his bedroll by the dying fire, Jude thought about the choice he'd made. He'd drawn a line in the sand, and there was no going back now. Whatever came next, he'd face it with his eyes open, and his conscience clear. It was a small comfort, but sometimes small comforts were all a man had to hold on to in a world that seemed determined to grind him down. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new choices to make. But tonight, he'd sleep with the satisfaction of knowing he'd done the right thing, even if it might be the last right thing he ever got the chance to do. The first lesson came 3 days later, when Lenora found Jude struggling over the ledger that tracked his ranch's finances. He sat at the kitchen table, squinting at the numbers by lamplight, his finger tracing each line like he was afraid the figures might rearrange themselves when he wasn't looking. "Problem?" she asked, setting a cup of coffee beside his elbow. "Can't make heads or tails of this," he admitted, rubbing his eyes. "I can read well enough, learned that much in the army, but these accounting books might as well be written in Chinese." Lenora pulled up a chair beside him and studied the ledger. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, numbers squeezed between lines in a way that made the whole enterprise look more like a battle than a business record. "May I?" she asked, reaching for the pencil. Jude handed it over, and she began working. Through the columns, her movements sure and practiced. Within minutes, she'd reorganized the entries, grouped similar expenses together, and tallied the results with swift, confident strokes. "You're not as deep in debt as you think," she said finally. "These numbers here, you've been counting some expenses twice. And this section," she pointed to a series of entries, "you're tracking feed costs for cattle you sold months ago." Jude leaned closer, studying her work. Her handwriting was clear and elegant, each number formed with the precision of someone who'd learned proper penmanship in a real school, not scratched-out lessons on a slate in a one-room schoolhouse. "Where'd you learn to do this?" "My father owned a general store back in St. Louis. I kept his books from the time I was 12. She made another notation, balancing a column with practiced ease. "Numbers tell stories, if you know how to listen to them. What story do these tell?" She was quiet for a moment, studying the figures. "They tell the story of a man who works harder than anyone should have to, who's been fighting a losing battle against circumstances beyond his control." She looked up at him. "But they also tell the story of someone who's too honest for his own good. You could have fudged these numbers, made things look better than they are to the bank. Instead, you've been scrupulously truthful even when it hurt." Something warm settled in Jude's chest at her words. It had been a long time since anyone had noticed his efforts, longer still since anyone had called them admirable. "Don't know. That honesty's done me much good," he said. "It's done you more good than you realize." She turned to a fresh page in the ledger and began sketching out a new organizational system. With proper bookkeeping, you could stretch your money further, maybe even find ways to improve the ranch without going deeper into debt. Over the next hour, she showed him how to track his expenses more efficiently, how to project future costs, how to identify areas where he might save money. It was like watching magic, the way she transformed his chaotic record-keeping into something that actually made sense. "You could teach school," he said when she finished. "Any town in the territory would be lucky to have someone with your learning." "Not any town," she replied quietly. "Word gets around. By now, half the territory knows I'm the woman who ran away from Ezra Blackwood. That makes me a scandal, not a schoolteacher." Jude felt anger flare in his chest, not at her, but at a world that would punish someone for refusing to accept abuse. "Their loss," he said. "Perhaps, but it means my options are limited." She closed the ledger and looked at him directly. "Which brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you." "I'm listening." "I want to earn my keep here. Really earn it, not just help out around the house." She pulled a small leather pouch from her dress pocket and set it on the table. "I have some money saved. Not much, but enough to buy supplies. If we're careful." Jude looked at the pouch but didn't touch it. "Where'd you get money?" "I sold some jewelry before I left St. Louis. Family pieces that were mine by right." Her voice carried a note of sadness. "I thought I'd need them for emergencies. Turns out I was right." "Keep your money," Jude said. We'll make do." "No," she said firmly. "I won't be a burden. If I'm going to stay here, I want to contribute something meaningful." She opened the pouch and counted out several silver coins. "This could buy seed for a kitchen garden, maybe some chickens. Small things that could make a difference." Jude studied her face in the lamplight. There was determination there, and something else, a kind of quiet pride that he recognized because he'd worn it himself. The pride of someone who'd rather struggle independently than accept charity, no matter how well-intentioned. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this as partners. Your money goes into the common fund, and we both have a say in how it's spent." "Partners," she agreed, and when she smiled it lit up the small kitchen like sunrise. The next morning they rode into town together to buy supplies. Jude had expected the same cold shoulders he'd received on his last visit, but what he found was something different, a mixture of curiosity and caution that suggested people weren't quite sure what to make of the situation. At the general store, Mrs. Peterson was polite but distant, filling their order efficiently, but without her usual a chatter. When Lenora asked about prices on garden seed, the older woman's expression softened slightly. "Planning to do some planting?" Mrs. Peterson asked. "Small kitchen garden," Lenora replied. "Tomatoes, beans, maybe some herbs." "Herbs are good," Mrs. Peterson said, warming to the subject despite herself. "My grandmother always said a woman who could grow her own medicine was worth her weight in gold." It was a small crack in the wall of community disapproval, but Jude noticed it. He also noticed the way Lenora handled herself. Polite, but not servile. Friendly, but not overeager. She had a natural dignity that was hard to dismiss, even for people who'd already made up their minds about her. At the feed store, they encountered their first real hostility. The owner, a man named Griggs, who'd always been fair in his dealings with Jude, barely looked up when they entered. "Don't know if I can extend any more credit," Griggs said without preamble. "We're paying cash," Jude replied evenly. That got Griggs's attention. He looked up from his paperwork, his eyes moving from Jude to Lenora and back again. "Cash, you say?" "That's right." Jude set $2 silver on the counter. "For chicken feed and wire for a coop." Griggs pocketed the money, but his expression remained sour. "Heard you've been keeping some interesting company, Colter." "I've been keeping my own business," Jude replied. "Recommend you do the same." "Hard to mind your own business when it affects the whole community," Griggs shot back. "Man like Blackwood don't forget when he's been crossed." Lenora stepped forward then, her voice calm and measured. "Mr. Griggs, isn't it? I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Lenora Vale." Griggs looked uncomfortable, caught between his desire to snub her and the basic manners his mother had drummed into him. "Ma'am," he said grudgingly. "I understand there's been some talk about my presence here," she continued. "I want you to know that Mr. Colter has shown me nothing but Christian kindness in my time of need. If that troubles you, I'm sorry for it, but I won't apologize for accepting help when it was offered." There was something in her tone, not defiance exactly, but a quiet strength that demanded respect. Griggs shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to say more, but not quite finding the words. "Your feed's in the back," he said finally. "Help yourself." As they loaded the supplies into Jude's wagon, Lenora was quiet, but he could see her mind working. She'd handled the confrontation well, better than he might have in her place. "You did good in there," he said as they drove out of town. "I've had practice dealing with difficult people," she replied. "My father's store served all kinds, some of them none too pleased to be dealing with a woman who could add figures faster than they could. That must have been hard. It taught me something valuable," she said. "Sometimes the best way to deal with people who want to diminish you is to refuse to be diminished, not through argument or anger, but through simple dignity." Jude thought about that as they made their way back to the ranch. Dignity, it was something he'd been in short supply of lately, what with the failing crops and mounting debts and the general sense that he was fighting a losing battle against forces beyond his control. But watching Lenora face down the communities, disapproval with such quiet strength. He felt something stir in him that had been dormant for too long. Maybe dignity wasn't something you lost when times got hard. Maybe it was something you chose to keep, no matter what the world threw at you. That afternoon, they worked together to clear a patch of ground for the kitchen garden. The soil was hard and dry, but underneath the crust, they found earth that might grow something with enough water and care. As they worked, Lenora told him stories from her childhood, about her father's store, about the books she'd read, about the dreams she'd once harbored of seeing the wider world. "What about you?" she asked, as they took a break in the shade of the house. "What did you dream about before the war?" Jude wiped sweat from his forehead and considered the question. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he'd been young enough to have dreams. "I wanted to build something," he said finally, "not just a ranch, but a real homestead. Place where a family could put down roots, where children could grow up safe and happy." He gestured at the struggling land around them. "Guess that was more dream than I could handle." "Dreams don't have expiration dates," Lenora said gently. "Sometimes they just take longer to come true than we expect. Some dreams aren't meant to come true at all, and some are just waiting for the right partner to help make them happen." There was something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. She was watching him with those intelligent eyes, and he saw something there that made his heart skip a beat. Not pity, not charity, but something warmer and more complicated. "Lenora," he started to say, but she held up a hand. "I know it's too soon to talk about such things," she said. "I know we're both carrying too much hurt to make clear decisions about the future, but I want you to know that I see what you're trying to build here, and I believe in it. I believe in you." That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, "Come out," Jude felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind that came from desperation, but the steady, warming kind that came from seeing possibilities where before there had been only obstacles. In his bedroom, hidden under the floorboard, his medal waited in its cigar box, like a reminder of who he used to be. But sitting beside Lenora in the cool desert night, listening to her talk about books and dreams and the endless potential of tomorrow, he began to think less about who he'd been and more about who he might yet become. The first step, he realized, was learning to see himself through her eyes, not as a failed rancher or a broken-down veteran, but as a man capable of building something lasting and good. It was a radical shift in perspective, and it would take time to fully embrace. But for the first time in years, he had time. And for the first time in longer than that, he had someone worth spending it with. The wooden comb took Jude 3 evenings to carve, working by lamplight after the day's chores were done. He'd found the piece of oak in his barn, part of a broken wagon wheel that the previous owner had left behind. The wood was seasoned and smooth, and as he worked it with his knife, it seemed to come alive under his hands. He wasn't much of a craftsman. His hands were better suited to handling cattle and mending fences than to the delicate work of carving. But there was something about the quiet concentration it required, the way each careful cut revealed a little more of what was hidden in the wood, that settled his mind in a way nothing had for months. Lenora didn't know what he was making. Night after supper, she would settle by the fire with one of the books she'd brought from St. Louis, thin volumes of poetry and philosophy that somehow seemed to make the small house feel larger, more civilized. She would read aloud sometimes, sharing passages that struck her as particularly beautiful or meaningful, and Jude would listen while his hands worked the wood. "Listen to this," she said on the third night, looking up from a collection of Emerson's essays. "What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us." She smiled at him across the room. "I think Mr. Emerson would have made a good rancher. How do you figure?" He understood that external circumstances don't define a person's worth. That real strength comes from inside. She marked her place in the book with a dried flower. "It's something I'm still learning, if I'm honest." Jude paused in his carving, studying her face in the firelight. "Seems to me You learned it pretty well already. Most people would have given up after what you went through. I came close, she admitted. There were moments tied to that cross when it would have been easier to just let go. Stop fighting. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the cover of her book. But then I'd remember my mother's voice telling me that Vale women don't quit, that we find a way no matter what. Tell me about her, Jude said, his knife making another careful cut along the comb's spine. She was remarkable. Came west with my father when she was barely 18, helped him build that store from nothing. She could calculate profit margins in her head faster than most men could do it on paper, and she never let anyone tell her what she was or wasn't capable of. Lenora's smile was soft with memory. She died when I was 16, but not before she made sure I could take care of myself. Reading, writing, arithmetic, but also practical things. How to judge character, how to stand up for myself, how to find strength when everything seems lost. Sounds like she raised a fine daughter. I hope so. Some days I feel like I'm still figuring out who I'm supposed to be. Jude finished the last delicate cut and held up the comb to examine his work. It wasn't perfect. The teeth weren't quite even, and there was a slight wobble in the handle where his knife had slipped. But it was honest work, made with care and attention, and he thought it might serve its purpose. "Lenora," he said, and she looked up from her book. He crossed the room and held out the comb, suddenly feeling foolish. "I made this for you." She set the book aside and took the comb in both hands, turning it over to examine every detail. Her fingers traced the smooth wood, testing the weight and balance of it. "Jude," she said softly, "it's beautiful." "It's not much," he said quickly. "I'm no craftsman, but I thought—" "Well, I noticed you don't have much in the way of personal things, and I thought maybe—" She stood and moved to the small mirror that hung by the kitchen window. Her hair had been pinned up with whatever pins she could salvage, but now she pulled them out and let the dark waves fall around her shoulders. Then slowly, she began to work the comb through her hair, section by section. Jude watched, transfixed. There was something intimate about the gesture, something that spoke of trust and acceptance that went deeper than words. When she was finished, she turned back to him, and he saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "No one's ever made anything for me before," she said. "Not with their own hands, not just because they wanted to." "I wanted to," he said simply. She crossed the room and before he could react, stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. It was a gentle kiss, soft as butterfly wings, but it sent warmth spreading through his chest like whiskey on a cold night. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood there for a moment, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. He wanted to reach out, to touch her face, to tell her all the things that had been building in his heart since the day he'd cut her down from that cross, but it was too soon. They both carried too much hurt, too much uncertainty about what the future might hold, so instead, he stepped back and cleared his throat. "You should get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She nodded, understanding. "Good night, Jude. Good night." He watched her disappear into the bedroom, then sat back down by the fire to clean up the wood shavings from his carving. The house felt different now, charged with something he couldn't quite name. Not just attraction, though that was certainly part of it, but something deeper. A sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. The next morning brought visitors. Jude was checking the fence line when he saw the buggy approaching, a single figure driving a tired-looking horse. As it got closer, he recognized Dr. Marcus Webb, the territory's only physician, and one of the few men in the area who seemed immune to Ezra Blackwood's influence. Doc Webb was in his 60s, a thin man with kind eyes and hands that had delivered off the babies in 3 counties. He'd tended Jude's injuries after a horse had thrown him 2 winters back, and they'd developed a mutual respect based on shared experience and common sense. "Morning, Jude," the doctor called as he climbed down from his buggy. "Heard you had some excitement out here recently." News travels fast, Jude replied, walking over to shake the older man's hand. In my line of work, it pays to know when someone might be needing medical attention. Doc Webb's eyes were sharp, despite his casual tone. Heard tell you found a woman in some distress. Found her, helped her, gave her a place to recover, Jude said carefully. Nothing more complicated than Christian charity. That's what I figured. The doctor nodded toward the house. Mind if I take a look at her? Professional curiosity, you understand. And maybe to set some minds at ease about her condition. Jude understood what the doctor was really offering. An independent medical assessment that might counter some of the wilder rumors circulating in town. I'll ask her, he said. Lenora agreed to the examination without hesitation. She understood, as Jude did, that having Doc Webb's word on her condition could only help their cause. While the doctor conducted his examination in private, Jude waited on the porch, trying not to pace. When they emerged 20 minutes later, Doc Webb's expression was grim. Miss Vale, he said formally, you're fortunate to be alive. The sun exposure alone could have killed you, not to mention the dehydration and the trauma to your wrists and ankles. He turned to Jude. Whoever did this to her, they meant for her to die, no question about it. Will you put that in writing? Lenora asked. Already planned to, the doctor replied. Whatever legal troubles you might be facing, you'll have my medical opinion to support your case. He paused, studying her face. Miss, I've been practicing medicine in this territory for 30 years. I've seen what men can do to women when they think no one's watching. What happened to you was attempted murder, plain and simple. Will anyone listen? She asked. Judge Morrison will, Doc Webb said. He's old-fashioned, but he's honest. Problem is getting your case before him without going through Sheriff Dalton first. It was the first real hope they'd had since the confrontation with Harwick and his men. Judge Morrison had a reputation for fairness, and if they could get their story before him, they might have a chance at real justice. What would we need to do? Jude asked. Gather evidence. Witnesses, if you can find any. Documentation of the abuse. The doctor looked at Lenora. Miss Vale, did anyone else know about the accusations against you? Anyone who might be willing to speak up? There was another woman, Lenora said slowly. Sarah Mitchell. She was supposed to be married to Blackwood's cousin, but something went wrong. She left town suddenly just before what happened to me. Where did she go? I don't know, but she might still be in the territory. She didn't have much money for travel. Doc Webb nodded thoughtfully. I'll ask around, see what I can find out. In the meantime, you two need to be careful. Blackwood's not the type to let this slide, and he's got men who aren't particular about how they handle problems. After the doctor left, Jude and Lenora sat on the porch and talked about what they'd learned. The possibility of finding Sarah Mitchell offered hope, but it also raised the stakes. If they pursued this course, there would be no backing down. Are you sure you want to do this? Jude asked. Fighting Blackwood in court is dangerous enough, but if we lose, we're no worse off than we are now, Lenora replied. And if we win, maybe we can stop him from hurting other women. That evening, as they worked together to prepare supper, Jude found himself watching Lenora in a new light. The comb he'd made for her held her hair back as she worked, and there was something deeply satisfying about seeing his handiwork put to such practical use. Penny for your thoughts, she said, catching him staring. Just thinking about what Doc Webb said, about gathering evidence, finding witnesses. He stirred the pot of beans on the stove. It's going to be dangerous, going up against Blackwood in court. Everything worthwhile is dangerous, she replied. The question is whether the risk is worth taking. And you think it is? She was quiet for a moment, considering. I think about that cross, Jude, about how it felt to be tied there, helpless, waiting to die. And I think about how many other women might face the same fate if someone doesn't stand up to him. She looked at him directly. Yes, I think it's worth the risk. That night, as they sat by the fire reading, her with her philosophy, him with the ranch ledger she'd reorganized, Jude felt the weight of the decision they were making. They were choosing to fight, choosing to risk everything for the chance at justice. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. For the first time since he'd bought the ranch, he felt like he was fighting for something bigger than just his own survival. He was fighting for the kind of world he wanted to live in, the kind of world where good people could build good lives without fear of those who would destroy them for sport. In the bedroom, Lenora brushed her hair with the comb he'd made, each stroke a reminder of his care and attention. And in his bedroll by the fire, Jude thought about the medal hidden under the floorboard, about the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but tonight he was exactly where he wanted to be. In his own home, with a woman he was learning to love, preparing to fight the good fight. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The branding iron arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 14. He rode up to the house on a lathered horse, tossed a wrapped bundle onto the porch, and spurred his mount back toward town without so much as a word. Jude knew what it was before he unwrapped it. The weight was unmistakable, the shape familiar to any man who'd worked cattle. But when he pulled away the burlap, he found something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just any branding iron. It was Ezra Blackwood's personal mark, a double B enclosed in a circle, the brand he used to mark his cattle, his property, his territory. The iron was still warm, recently heated, and burned into the wooden handle was a simple message. Everything has an owner. Lenora appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of hoofbeats. She took one look at the iron in Jude's hands and went pale. "He's claiming me," she said quietly, "like livestock." Jude felt rage build in his chest, hot and pure as forge fire. "He's claiming nothing. This is just intimidation." "Is it?" She stepped onto the porch and looked down at the iron. "Or is it a promise?" Before Jude could answer, another rider appeared. On the horizon, this one approached slowly, deliberately, and Jude recognized the lean figure of Tom Harwick even at a distance. The foreman was alone this time, but that somehow made him seem more dangerous, not less. "Morning, Colter," Harwick called as he reined in his horse. His eyes went to the branding iron in Jude's hands, and his smile was sharp as a blade. "See you got Mr. Blackwood's message." "I got it," Jude replied, his voice steady. "Question is, what am I supposed to do with it?" "Well, now, that depends." Harwick dismounted and walked closer, his hand resting casual-like on his gun butt. "Mr. Blackwood's been thinking about your situation. Seems to him you might be operating under some misunderstandings about the law." "What kind of misunderstandings?" Harwick reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded document. "This here's a copy of the contract Miss Vale signed back. In St. Louis, legal and binding, witnessed and notarized." He held it out toward Lenora. "Maybe you'd like to read the fine print, ma'am." Lenora took the document with steady hands, though Jude could see the tension in her shoulders. She unfolded it and read, her face growing paler with each line. "This isn't the contract I signed," she said finally. "That's so?" Harwick's voice carried mock surprise. "Funny thing about contracts, ma'am. Sometimes people remember them different than they actually read. This says, I'm bound to Mr. Blackwood for a period of 5 years, regardless of whether a marriage takes place." Lenora's voice was tight with controlled anger. "The contract I signed specified marriage only. If no marriage occurred, I was free to leave. Like I said, memory's a funny thing." Harwick took the document back and tucked it away. "But this... Here's the original, filed with the territorial court. Judge Dalton himself witnessed the filing." Jude felt the trap closing around them. A forged contract, filed with a corrupt judge, backed by Blackwood's money and influence. It was exactly the kind of legal maneuvering that made frontier justice a mockery. "There's more," Harwick continued. "Mr. Blackwood's been generous enough to calculate Miss Vale's debts, transportation from St. Louis, room and board, medical expenses after her unfortunate accident. Comes to quite a sum." "How much?" Jude asked, though he dreaded the answer. $800. The number hit Jude like a physical blow. $800 was more money than his ranch was worth, more than he could earn in 3 good years. It might as well have been 8,000. That's robbery, Lenora said. That's business, Harwick replied. But Mr. Blackwood's a reasonable man. He's prepared to offer alternatives to immediate payment. What kind of alternatives? Harwick's smile widened. Miss Vale could return to fulfill her contract. Work off her debt honest-like, the way it was originally planned. Or, Jude asked because he could see there was more coming. Or you could sign over the deed to this ranch. Mr. Blackwood's been looking to expand his water rights, and your spread sits right nice between his north and south pastures. There it was, the real purpose behind all the legal maneuvering. Blackwood didn't just want Lenora back, he wanted Jude's land. The contract was just a convenient excuse to squeeze them both. And if we refuse both options, Lenora asked, then Sheriff Dalton comes out here with a warrant for your arrest, Harwick said. Theft of services, breach of contract, maybe some other charges that occur to him along the way. He looked at Jude. Might be you'd find yourself charged as an accessory, harboring a fugitive, interfering with legal business. Jude set the branding, ironed down on the porch railing with deliberate care. Tom, you can tell your boss that he can take his contract and his threats and... Jude. Lenora's voice was quiet but firm. Don't. He looked at her, surprised by the warning. Mr. Harwick, she said, turning to face the foreman, I need time to consider Mr. Blackwood's generous offer. Surely a decision of this magnitude deserves careful thought. Harwick studied her face, looking for signs of deception. How much time? A week? 3 days? 5 days? Done. Harwick mounted his horse and touched the brim of his hat. 5 days, Miss Vale. After that, Sheriff Dalton comes calling. He looked at Jude. Might want to think real careful about which side of this you want to be on, Colter. Man. Can't fight City Hall and expect to win. After Harwick rode away, Jude and Lenora stood on the porch in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The branding iron seemed to loom between them, a physical reminder of the power arrayed against them. Why did you ask for time? Jude asked finally. We both know we're not going to give him what he wants. Because I needed to think, she replied, and because desperate people make mistakes. She picked up the branding iron, testing its weight. This isn't just about intimidation, Jude. It's about ownership. Blackwood sees me as property, and he'll never stop until he gets me back or destroys me trying. Then we fight him. With what? He's got the law on his side, money to buy witnesses, and enough men to enforce his will by violence if necessary. She set the iron down and looked at him. We need more than righteous anger to win this fight. That afternoon, they rode into town together, ostensibly to buy supplies, but really to gauge the local sentiment. What they found was a community that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. At the general store, Mrs. Peterson was polite but nervous, glancing frequently toward the door as if expecting trouble. When Lenora asked about fabric for new curtains, the older woman seemed surprised. You're planning to stay? She asked. I'm planning to fight, Lenora replied quietly. The question is whether anyone else is willing to stand up to injustice. Mrs. Peterson looked around the empty store, then leaned closer. There's others who've had trouble with the Blackwoods, she whispered. Women who came and went real quick-like. Nobody talks about it, but people remember. Where are they now? Some moved on to other territories. But Sarah Mitchell, she's working at the boarding house over in Copper Creek. That's only a day's ride from here. It was the first concrete lead they'd had on finding witnesses. Copper Creek was a mining town, rough around the edges, but far enough from Blackwood's influence that a woman might feel safe speaking the truth. At the saloon, Jude nursed a beer and listened to the conversations around him. The talk was careful, coded, but the message was clear. Blackwood was squeezing hard, and people were choosing sides. Heard Colter's got himself into a real fix, one man was saying. Picked the wrong fight with the wrong man. Maybe, another replied. But there's something to be said for a man who stands up for what's right. Standing up's one thing, winning's another. Sometimes winning ain't the point. Sometimes it's just about not backing down. When Jude and Lenora returned to the ranch that evening, they found evidence that they weren't the only ones making preparations. Fresh horse tracks circled the property, and several of their cattle had been driven off, not stolen outright, but moved to the far edges of Jude's range, close to Blackwood's land. "He's testing us," Lenora observed as they stood looking at the scattered herd, "seeing how we'll respond to pressure. Or he's getting ready to claim the cattle strayed onto his land," Jude replied grimly. "Old trick. Move your neighbor's stock, then file a claim for damages." That night, as they planned their trip to Copper Creek, Jude found himself thinking about the branding iron sitting on his kitchen table. It was meant to be a symbol of ownership, of Blackwood's power to mark and claim whatever he wanted. But symbols could be turned against their creators. The iron was proof of Blackwood's arrogance, evidence of his willingness to use intimidation and threats. In the right hands, before the right judge, it might become a weapon instead of a warning. "Lenora," he said as she prepared for bed, "tomorrow we ride to Copper Creek, we find Sarah Mitchell, and we start building our case. And if we can't find enough evidence, if the law won't protect us..." Jude thought about the medal hidden in his bedroom, about the skills he'd learned in 4 years of war. "Then we make our own justice." She studied his face in the lamplight, and he saw understanding pass between them. They were past the point of hoping for easy solutions. Whatever came next would require courage, cunning, and a willingness to risk everything for the chance to build something better. "All right," she said simply. "We fight." Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds dancing across the yard. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, and another answered from across the valley. The sound seemed to echo the loneliness and wildness of the land itself, but also its enduring strength. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight they had each other, and they had a plan. It was more than they'd had a week ago, and it would have to be enough. The locket was the first thing Lenora showed him when they stopped to water their horses at Willow Creek. They'd been riding since dawn, making good time toward Copper Creek, and the sun was climbing high when she dismounted and walked to the creek's edge, her hand going instinctively to her throat. "I haven't opened this in months," she said, her fingers working at the delicate clasp. "Couldn't bear to look at it after everything that happened." Jude hobbled the horses and joined her. By the water, the creek ran clear and cool, fed by mountain springs that never seemed to run dry even in the worst drought years. It was one of the few constant things in this harsh country, a reminder that some sources of strength never failed. The locket was small, no bigger than a silver dollar, worn smooth by years of handling. When Lenora finally got it open, Jude saw the faded photograph inside, a woman with Lenora's eyes and a smile that spoke of quiet strength. "My mother," Lenora said softly, "Lenora Vale. I was named for her, though everyone called her Ellie." The photograph showed a woman in her 30s, wearing a simple dress, but carrying herself with unmistakable dignity. There was something in her expression that reminded Jude of Lenora, an intelligence that couldn't be hidden, a strength that couldn't be broken. "She was beautiful," he said. "She was strong," Lenora replied. "Stronger than anyone knew, including my father sometimes." She traced the edge of the photograph with one finger. "When I was little, she used to tell me stories about her grandmother, who came west in a covered wagon with nothing but a few family treasures and an iron will to survive." What happened to her grandmother? Built a farm from nothing, raised 6 children, and lived to see her great-grandchildren. Lenora smiled at the memory. "Mother always said the women in our family were like water. We found a way around any obstacle, wore down any resistance, and always kept moving forward." Jude thought about that as they remounted and continued toward Copper Creek, Water. It was something he'd been thinking about a lot lately, watching his wells drop and his cattle suffer. But Lenora was right about its persistence. Water always. "You've found a way, given enough time and patience. Tell me more about her," he said as they rode. "Your mother. She met my father when she was 18, working in her uncle's store in St. Louis. He was a traveling salesman then, full of big dreams and bigger promises." Lenora's voice carried warmth and amusement. She said she knew he'd never be rich. But he made her laugh, and that was worth more than money. Sounds like she was right. In most ways, yes. He never did get rich, but he built a good business, treated his customers fairly, and gave Mother a partnership in everything he did. She paused, her expression growing serious. "That's what I thought marriage was supposed to be, a partnership between equals. Not what you found with Blackwood. Blackwood never intended a partnership. He wanted an ornament, something pretty, and compliant to show off to his friends." Her voice hardened. "When he realized I had opinions of my own, that I could think and reason, and wouldn't just nod and smile, he decided I was defective merchandise." They reached Copper Creek just after noon, finding it much as Jude had expected. A rough mining town that had sprung up around a silver strike, built for function rather than beauty. The main street was dirt and gravel, lined with practical buildings that looked like they could be packed up and moved at a moment's notice. The boarding house was easy enough to find. A 2-story wooden structure with a sign that read, "Clean rooms, fair prices, no drunks." It was run by a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Garrett, who looked them over with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every type of traveler the frontier had to offer. "We're looking for Sarah Mitchell," Lenora explained. "We understand she's working here." Mrs. Garrett's expression grew guarded. "What's your business with Sarah?" "We're friends," Lenora said simply, "from back east." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. Sometimes the truth needed to be approached sideways, especially when dealing with people who'd learned to be careful about strangers asking questions. "Sarah's in the kitchen," Mrs. Garrett said finally. "But I'll warn you, she don't talk much about where she came from. Girl's been through some hard times." They found Sarah Mitchell washing dishes in the boarding house kitchen, her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back with practical efficiency. She was younger than Lenora, probably no more than 20, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of experiences that aged a person beyond their years. When she saw Lenora, the plate in her hand slipped and shattered on the floor. "Sarah," Lenora said gently, "it's all right. I'm a friend." The young woman looked around the kitchen as if seeking escape, then seemed to realize there was nowhere to go. "You're her," she said quietly. "You're the one who was supposed to marry Ezra Blackwood. I'm Lenora Vale, and you're Sarah Mitchell." Sarah knelt to pick up the broken pieces of the plate, her hands shaking slightly. "I heard what happened to you, what they did." She looked up at Lenora with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I should have warned you, should have done something." "There was nothing you could have done," Lenora said, kneeling down to help gather the broken pieces. "But maybe there's something we can do now." Over the next hour, as they sat in Mrs. Garrett's parlor with the door closed, Sarah told them her story. It was disturbingly similar to Lenora's, a mail-order bride arrangement that had gone wrong when she'd failed to meet the Blackwood family's expectations. "I was supposed to marry Daniel Blackwood, Ezra's cousin," Sarah explained. "But when I got there, I found out Daniel was simple, not right in the head, you understand. Sweet enough, but with the mind of a child." "And they expected you to go through with the marriage anyway?" Jude asked. "Martha Blackwood said it was my Christian duty to care for him, that I'd been brought there to be his nurse as much as his wife." Sarah's voice grew bitter. "When I objected, when I said I'd been deceived about the arrangement, she started talking about how I was ungrateful, how I was trying to cheat the family." "What happened then?" "Martha started spreading rumors about me in town. Said I was a loose woman, that I'd been carrying on with other men. Before long, people were looking at me like I was something unclean. Sarah touched her throat unconsciously, and Jude noticed a faint scar there. Then one night, some of Ezra's men came to the boarding house where I was staying, said they were going to teach me some respect. Lenora reached over and took the young woman's hand. They hurt you. They tried to, but the boarding house owner had a shotgun, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Sarah's smile was shaky, but genuine. Old Mr. Henderson ran them off, then helped me get out of town that same night. Sarah, Lenora said carefully, would you be willing to testify about what happened to you? In court, before a judge. The young woman went pale. They'd kill me if I testified against them. Not if we do this right, Jude said. There's an honest judge in the territorial court. If we can get your case and Lenora's before him together, show the pattern of abuse. You don't understand, Sarah interrupted. The Blackwoods don't just have money and influence. They have people in every town, every business. They'd find me wherever I went. Lenora opened the locket around her neck and showed Sarah the photograph. This is my mother. She used to tell me that the women in our family were like water. We found a way around any obstacle. She looked directly at Sarah. But sometimes water needs to join with other water to become a flood. Sarah stared at the photograph, and Jude could see her thinking, weighing her fear against her anger. There's others, she said finally. Other women who had trouble with the Blackwoods. If we could find them. How many others? I know of at least 3. Maybe more. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Women who came as mail-order brides, or who worked for the family, or who just caught their attention somehow. All of them ended up running, or worse. Jude felt a cold anger building in his chest. This wasn't just about Lenora anymore, wasn't just about one man's twisted sense of ownership. This was about a pattern of abuse that had been going on for years, protected by money and silence. Where are these women now? He asked. Scattered. Some went back east, some moved to other territories, but I keep in touch with a few of them, when I can. Sarah looked at Lenora with something like hope in her eyes. If we could bring them together, if we could all tell our stories at once, it would be harder to dismiss as the word of one disgruntled woman, Lenora finished. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning, working out how to contact the other women, how to coordinate their testimonies, how to present a united front against the Blackwood Empire. It was dangerous. Bringing together multiple witnesses would also make them a more tempting target for Blackwood's retaliation. But as Jude watched Lenora and Sarah work together, sharing strategies and drawing strength from each other, he began to understand something his mother had tried to teach him years ago. Some battles couldn't be fought alone. Some victories required people to stand together, even when, especially when, the odds seemed impossible. As they prepared to leave Copper Creek, Sarah gave Lenora something unexpected, a small leather journal filled with names and locations of other women who'd had trouble with the Blackwoods. I've been keeping track, Sarah explained, writing down everything I could remember, everything I heard. I thought maybe someday someone would be brave enough to use it. Lenora held the journal like the precious thing it was. Sarah, this is evidence of a conspiracy. This could bring down the whole operation. Then use it, Sarah said fiercely. Use it to make sure no other woman goes through what we went through. That night, as they camped under the stars on the way back to the ranch, Lenora showed Jude some of the entries in Sarah's journal. Name after name, story after story, all painting a picture of systematic abuse and intimidation. How many do you think would be willing to testify? He asked. I don't know, but even if only half of them agreed, it would be enough to show a pattern. She closed the journal and looked up at the stars. Jude, what we're talking about doing, it's not just about seeking justice for ourselves anymore. I know. It's about stopping them from hurting anyone else. It's about making sure no other woman ends up tied to a cross in the desert. Jude thought about his mother's locket, hidden away for safekeeping back at the ranch. Lenora Vale had raised a daughter who understood that some fights were bigger than any one person, that some stands had to be taken regardless of the personal cost. We'll do it, he said. We'll find these women and we'll bring them together. And we'll tell the whole truth in front of God and everybody, even if it destroys us, especially if it destroys us." He looked at her across the dying campfire. "Because some things are more important than our own survival." She nodded, understanding. In the morning, they would ride back to the ranch and begin the dangerous work of building a case that could topple an empire. But tonight, under the vast desert sky, they held each other and drew strength from the knowledge that they weren't fighting alone anymore. Somewhere in the darkness, a night bird called to its mate, and another answered. The sound carried across the empty miles, a reminder that even in the loneliest places, there was always the possibility of connection, of finding others who shared your song. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But it would also bring new allies, new hope, and the growing certainty that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds. The locket around Lenora's neck caught the firelight, holding the image of a woman who'd never lived to see this moment, but whose strength lived on in her daughter's courage. Some legacies, Jude realized, were stronger than the people who left them behind, and some fights were worth finishing, no matter how long they took. The forged legal documents arrived with Sheriff Dalton himself 3 days before their deadline expired. Jude was repairing a section of fence when he saw the dust cloud approaching, not just the sheriff, but a whole procession that included a territorial judge, a clerk with a leather satchel, and enough deputies to handle serious trouble. Lenora emerged from the house as the riders approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been baking bread, filling the house with the warm scent of civilization in a place that sometimes felt like the edge of the world. Now she stood beside Jude, and he could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. "Morning, Colter," Sheriff Dalton called out as he dismounted. He was a heavy-set man, with shrewd eyes and a politician's smile. "Got some official business to conduct." The man who climbed down from the buggy was introduced as Judge Hartwell, a thin, nervous-looking fellow who kept glancing around as if expecting trouble. Behind him came the clerk, a young man who seemed more interested in getting this business finished than in seeing justice done. "Mr. Colter, Miss Vale," Judge Hartwell said formally, "I'm here to execute a writ of attachment for breach of contract and theft of services." "What contract?" Jude asked, though he suspected he already knew. The clerk opened his satchel and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers. "The marriage contract between Miss Lenora Vale and Mr. Ezra Blackwood, duly witnessed and notarized in St. Louis, Missouri, and filed with this territorial court." Lenora stepped forward. "May I see it?" Judge Hartwell nodded to the clerk, who handed over the documents. As Lenora read, her face grew pale, then flushed with anger. "This isn't the contract I signed," she said firmly. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Vale," the judge replied. "Are you suggesting that officers of this court have falsified legal documents?" "I'm saying this contract is a forgery." She held up the papers. "The original contract I signed specified that if Mr. Blackwood found me unsuitable for marriage, I would be free to leave with my transportation costs covered. This version says I'm bound to serve the Blackwood family for 5 years, regardless of whether a marriage takes place." "Judge," Hartwell looked uncomfortable. "Do you have a copy of the original contract?" "No, I was told the copy would be sent to me after the marriage ceremony." "Then I'm afraid it's your word against documented evidence," the judge said, "and this court must rely on official records." Jude felt the trap closing around them. It was exactly what they'd expected, but seeing it play out still felt like a physical blow. The whole legal system was rigged, bought and paid for by Blackwood's money. "Judge," he said carefully, "might I ask who witnessed this contract in St. Louis?" The clerk consulted the documents. "A Mr. Harrison Webb and a Mrs. Margaret Finch, both residents of St. Louis." Lenora's eyes widened. "Harrison Webb is dead. He died 2 months before I left St. Louis. I attended his funeral myself." A murmur went through the assembled men. Even Sheriff Dalton looked surprised by this revelation. "Are you certain?" Judge Hartwell asked. "Absolutely certain. Mr. Webb was my father's business partner. I helped my father close out his affairs. After the funeral," the judge looked at the clerk, who shuffled through the papers with growing agitation. "The document is dated 3 weeks before Miss Vale's departure from St. Louis, which would be 6 weeks after Harrison Webb died," Lenora said flatly. Judge Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. When he looked up, his expression had changed subtly. "Miss Vale, this is a very serious allegation. If these documents have been falsified, it would constitute fraud on a territorial level. I'm prepared to swear to it before God and this court," Lenora replied. "Even so, I would need corroborating evidence. The word of the accused party alone is insufficient to overturn documented contracts." It was then that Jude made a decision. "That would change everything. Judge Hartwell, what if I told you this wasn't an isolated case? What if I could provide evidence of a pattern of forged contracts and false documentation?" The judge's eyebrows rose. "What kind of evidence?" Jude looked at Lenora, who gave him a slight nod. They'd agreed to save Sarah's journal as a last resort. But it seemed that moment had arrived. "Lenora," he said quietly. She reached into her dress pocket and withdrew the leather journal Sarah had given them. "Judge Hartwell, this contains documentation of at least 6 other women who were brought to this territory under similar contracts, all of whom were subjected to abuse and false imprisonment." She handed the journal to the judge, who opened it and began reading. As he scanned the pages, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "From one of the victims, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who was supposed to marry into the Blackwood family, but escaped when they tried to force her into an unwanted arrangement." Judge Hartwell continued reading, his face growing paler with each page. "These are very serious accusations, Miss Vale. Forgery, fraud, false imprisonment, conspiracy, all documented," Lenora said, "with names, dates, and witnesses." Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, clearly agitated. "Judge, we came here to execute a legal writ, not to listen to wild accusations." "Sheriff Dalton," the judge interrupted sharply, "how many of these cases came through your office?" The sheriff's face flushed red. "I don't know what you're talking about. According to this journal, at least 3 of these women filed complaints with local law enforcement." "What happened to those complaints?" "I'd have to check my records." "You'd have to check your records." Judge Hartwell's voice rose. "Sheriff, these allegations suggest a systematic conspiracy to defraud and abuse women under color of law. If even half of what's documented here is true, this territory is facing a criminal enterprise of unprecedented scope." The clerk leaned over to whisper something in the judge's ear, but Hartwell waved him away. "No, this changes everything. I cannot in good conscience execute a writ based on documentation that may be fraudulent." Sheriff Dalton's hand moved toward his gun. "Judge, I think you're making a mistake." "The only mistake would be proceeding without a thorough investigation." Judge Hartwell closed the journal and looked directly at the sheriff. "Sheriff Dalton, I'm ordering a full territorial investigation into these allegations. All related cases are hereby suspended pending review." "You can't do that," Dalton protested. "These are local matters. These are federal matters if they involve mail fraud and conspiracy across state lines," the judge corrected. "And as a territorial judge, I have full authority to order such an investigation." Jude watched the exchange with growing amazement. They'd expected to lose this confrontation, to be arrested or forced to flee. Instead, they'd managed to turn the tables completely, but Sheriff Dalton wasn't finished. "Judge, I respect your authority, but I've got my orders from whom?" Judge Hartwell asked sharply. "Who gave you orders regarding this case?" The sheriff's mouth clamped shut, but the damage was done. Everyone present understood the implication. "I see," the judge said quietly. "Sheriff, you're relieved of duty pending the outcome of this investigation." Deputy Morrison, you'll assume temporary command of local law enforcement. One of the younger deputies stepped forward, looking stunned. Sir, I don't know if I'm qualified. You're qualified if you can follow the law instead of whoever's paying. The most, Judge Hartwell replied. Your first duty is to ensure these witnesses are protected until they can testify before a proper tribunal. As the confrontation continued to unfold, Jude began to understand just how deep the corruption ran. This wasn't just about Ezra Blackwood's abuse of mail-order brides. This was about a systematic takeover of local government, law enforcement, and the courts themselves. The forged documents weren't just evidence of fraud, they were evidence of a conspiracy that reached into every level of territorial authority. And now, thanks to Sarah's journal and Lenora's courage, that conspiracy was beginning to unravel. Judge Hartwell turned to address Jude and Lenora directly. Miss Vale, Mr. Colter, I want you to understand the gravity of what you've initiated. Here, if these allegations prove true, we're looking at criminal charges against some of the most powerful men in the territory. We understand, Your Honor, Lenora replied, and we're prepared to see it through to the end. Good, because the men you're accusing won't go quietly. They have resources, influence, and a lot to lose. The judge looked around at the assembled. Men, from this moment forward, you're both under the protection of this court. Anyone who attempts to intimidate or harm you will be answering to federal authorities. As the official party prepared to leave, Judge Hartwell pulled Jude aside. Mr. Colter, I hope you understand what you've gotten yourself into. Blackwood has been building his power base for years. He's not going to let this investigation proceed without a fight. I understand, Judge, but someone had to stand up to him eventually. Yes. But did it have to be a struggling rancher and a woman with no family or connections? The judge's expression was sympathetic but concerned. You're going to need all the help you can get. We'll manage. See that you do. Because if this investigation fails, if Blackwood manages to discredit you or eliminate the evidence, those forged contracts will stand, and every woman documented in that journal will remain at his mercy. That evening, as they sat on their porch and watched the sun set over the desert, Jude and Lenora tried to process what had happened. In the space of a single afternoon, they'd gone from facing arrest to becoming the key witnesses in a territorial investigation. Do you think we can trust Judge Hartwell? Lenora asked. I think he's honest, Jude replied. But honest doesn't mean powerful. Blackwood still has advantages we don't. Such as? Money, for one thing. Time, for another. And the home field advantage. Jude leaned back in his chair. An investigation takes time to complete. Meanwhile, Blackwood will be working to discredit us, eliminate witnesses, maybe even arrange for accidents to happen to people who know too much. Lenora was quiet for a moment, considering. Jude, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. All right. Are you sorry? Sorry you cut me down from that cross? Sorry you got involved in this fight? He looked at her. Really? Looked at her, taking in the strength in her shoulders, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet courage that had transformed both their lives. No, he said finally, I'm not sorry. Even if this destroys us both, I'm not sorry. Good, she said, reaching over to take his hand, because I'm not sorry either, as they sat together in the gathering darkness, holding hands and watching the first stars appear. Jude felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves now, something that mattered more than their individual fates. The forged documents had been meant to trap them, to force them into submission through the weight of fraudulent law. Instead, they'd become the key that unlocked a much larger truth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. Blackwood would strike back, and when he did, it would be with everything he had. But tonight they'd won a victory that neither of them had dared to hope for. The law, it turned out, still meant something when it was wielded by honest hands. And sometimes, just sometimes, the truth was stronger than money, influence, or the accumulated power of corrupt men. It was a small comfort in a dangerous world, but sometimes small comforts were all you needed to keep fighting. And fight they would until justice was done or they died in the attempt. Some battles, after all, were worth everything you had to give. The field manual came out of its hiding place the morning after Judge Hartwell's visit. Jude hadn't touched it in 3 years, hadn't even thought about it much since he'd packed it away with the rest of his military gear. But now, as he spread the worn pages across his kitchen table, he felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. Reconnaissance and advance positioning for small unit operations. Lenora read aloud, looking over his shoulder. "This was yours," written by someone a lot smarter than me, but I added my own notes over the years. Jude pointed to the margins, filled with cramped handwriting in pencil and ink. 4 years of learning how to stay alive when the other side has more men, more supplies, and better position. And you think we're going to need military tactics? Lenora, what we did yesterday was declare war on the most powerful man in 3 counties. He's got money, influence, and men who aren't particular about how they handle problems. Jude traced her finger along a diagram showing defensive positions. We need to think like soldiers now, because that's what this has become. A war. The first thing the manual taught was the importance of intelligence gathering. Know your enemy, know his resources, know his weaknesses. So while Lenora worked on reaching out to the women in Sarah's journal, Jude began a careful reconnaissance of the Blackwood Empire. What he found was sobering. Ezra Blackwood didn't just own the Double B Ranch. He had financial interests in the bank, the general store, the feed mill, and half the businesses in town. He employed directly or indirectly nearly a quarter of the local population. He was the kind of man who could destroy someone's livelihood with a word, who could make life impossible for anyone who crossed him. But the manual also taught that every fortress had weak points, every army had supply lines that could be cut. And as Jude studied the scope of Blackwood's operations, he began to see potential vulnerabilities. His power comes from isolation, Jude explained to Lenora as they worked together that evening. He controls information, controls who talks to who, makes sure his victims never realize they're not alone. That's why Sarah's journal is so important, Lenora replied. It breaks that isolation, shows the pattern. Exactly. But we need more than documentation. We need the women themselves willing to stand up and testify. Jude consulted the list they'd compiled from the journal. How many have you been able to contact? 3 so far. Mary Catherine O'Brien in Denver, Rebecca Walsh in Santa Fe, and Elizabeth Chen in Tucson. Lenora set down her pen and rubbed her tired eyes. All of them are scared, but they're willing to listen. What about the others? Still trying. Some have moved on, some have married, and taken new names. It's slow work. The manual emphasized the importance of secure communications, and Jude found himself applying those lessons to their current situation. They couldn't trust the local telegraph office. Too many people in Blackwood's pocket, so they relied on trusted messengers, coded letters, and careful face-to-face meetings. Dr. Webb proved invaluable in this effort. As the territory's only physician, he had reason to travel widely, and he could carry messages without raising suspicion. More importantly, he commanded respect throughout the region. When Doc Webb vouched for someone, people listened. Found another one, he reported during one of his visits. Anna Kowalski, working as a seamstress in Albuquerque. She's willing to testify, but she wants guarantees about her safety. What kind of guarantees? Jude asked. Relocation assistance, protection during the trial, maybe a new identity afterward. Doc Webb's expression was grim. She's terrified, Jude. Says Blackwood's men tracked her to 2 different towns before she finally got far enough away. It was a pattern they were seeing repeatedly. Blackwood didn't just abuse these women, he hunted them afterward, making sure they could never feel safe enough to speak out. It was systematic intimidation on a scale that shocked even Jude, who thought he'd seen the worst of human nature during the war. But the manual also taught that fear could be turned into anger, and anger into action. Each woman they contacted, each story they documented, added to the growing momentum of their cause. "We're building something here," Lenora said one evening as they reviewed their progress. "Not just a legal case, but a community of survivors. Women who thought they were alone, discovering they're part of something larger." The defensive preparations began in earnest after Deputy Morrison brought word that Blackwood's men had been asking questions around town, who had been visiting the Colter ranch, who had been carrying messages, who might be sympathetic to their cause. "He's gathering intelligence too," Morrison warned, "and from what I hear, he's not planning to wait for the territorial investigation to conclude." That night, Jude walked the perimeter of his property with new eyes, seeing it not as a struggling ranch, but as a potential battlefield. The house sat on high ground with good visibility in all directions. The barn and outbuildings could provide cover and defensive positions. The well was close enough to the house to ensure water during a siege. "You're thinking like a soldier again," Lenora observed, watching him pace off distances and angles. "I'm thinking like a survivor," he corrected. "The manual says the best defense is preparation, and the best preparation assumes the worst-case scenario, which is Blackwood decides we're too dangerous to let live and sends his men to solve the problem permanently." They spent the next several days making subtle preparations. Jude cleaned and oiled his weapons, checked his ammunition supply, and established clear fields of fire from the house windows. Lenora helped by preparing emergency supplies, food, water, medical kit, money for travel if they needed to run. But their most important preparation was strategic. Following the manual's guidance on building alliances, they reached out to everyone who might be willing to help. Not just the women from Sarah's journal, but sympathetic townspeople, honest lawmen from other jurisdictions, even some of Blackwood's own employees who had grown tired of his methods. "The key is building a network," Jude explained as they worked, "so that if something happens to us, the information doesn't die with us." The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Deputy Morrison arrived with news that changed everything. "Judge Hartwell's called for a territorial grand jury," he announced. "They're convening in Santa Fe next month to hear testimony about the Blackwood case." "A grand jury?" Lenora asked. 23 citizens from across the territory, empowered to investigate criminal activity and issue indictments. Morrison's excitement was evident. "This is big, folks. If the grand jury believes your evidence, they can indict Blackwood and his associates on federal charges." It was the validation they'd been hoping for, proof that their fight was being taken seriously at the highest levels, but it also meant the stakes had just gotten infinitely higher. "Blackwood will know about this," Jude said grimly. "He'll know exactly what it means for him and his operation, which means he'll try to stop it," Lenora added. "By any means necessary," Morrison confirmed. "Judge Hartwell's already requested federal marshals to protect the key witnesses, but that protection won't start until they're officially summoned." Jude consulted his field manual again, looking for guidance on protecting a fixed position with limited resources. What he found wasn't encouraging. The manual was clear. When facing superior forces, the defender's best option was usually tactical withdrawal to a more defensible position. But they couldn't withdraw. Too many people were counting on them. Too much was at stake. They would have to make their stand here on ground of Blackwood's choosing, with whatever resources they could muster. "We need help," he told Lenora that evening. "Real help, not just moral support." "What kind of help?" "Armed men willing to stand with us. People with military experience, or at least people who know how to handle themselves in a fight." It was then that Doc Webb provided another surprise. "I might know some folks," he said when they explained their situation. "Veterans like yourself, men who came west after the war and never quite found their place. They're scattered around the territory, working small ranches or odd jobs, but they remember what it means to fight for something that matters. How many men are we talking about? Maybe a dozen if they're all willing, maybe more if word spreads. Doc Webb's expression was serious. But Jude, once you call them in, there's no going back. This becomes a real war with real casualties. Jude thought about the medal hidden in his bedroom, about the men he'd led into battle during the war, about the friend he'd lost, saving others. He thought about Lenora, brave and determined, willing to risk everything for justice. He thought about all the women whose stories were documented in Sarah's journal, and all the women who might suffer in the future if they failed. "Make the calls, Doc," he said finally. "It's time to gather the troops." As they prepared for what might be their final battle, Jude found himself reading and rereading certain passages in the field manual. The ones about leadership under fire, about making impossible decisions, about the weight of command when other people's lives hung in the balance. "Are you afraid?" Lenora asked him one night as they sat by the fire, listening to the desert wind. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing, afraid that all these people who are trusting us, believing in us, will suffer because I made the wrong choice." "You didn't make this choice," she reminded him. "Blackwood did, when he decided that people were property he could buy and sell and dispose of as he pleased. Maybe. But I chose to cut you down from that cross. I chose to stand up to his men. I chose to turn this into a war. And I chose to stay. To fight beside you, to risk everything for the chance at justice." She reached over and took his hand. "We made these choices together, Jude. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Outside, something moved in the darkness. Probably just a coyote or a stray cow, but enough to remind them that they were being watched, that their enemies were gathering just as surely as their allies. The field manual lay open between them, its pages filled with the hard-won wisdom of men who had faced impossible odds and somehow found a way to prevail. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of their resolve, but tonight they had each other, they had a plan, and they had the quiet satisfaction of knowing they were fighting the good fight. In a world full of compromise and corruption, that was worth more than all of Blackwood's money and influence combined. The battle was coming, whether they were ready or not. All they could do was prepare as best they could and trust that sometimes, just sometimes, right made. Might it would have to be enough because it was all they had. The rifle had been his companion through 4 years of war, a .50 caliber Springfield that had never failed him when his life depended on its accuracy. Jude cleaned it one more time in the pre-dawn darkness, running the oiled cloth along the barrel with practiced precision. His hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual, but his mind was focused on the ridgeline, where the first faint hint of sunrise was beginning to show. They would come with the sun, he knew. Blackwood's men weren't the type to attack. In darkness, they preferred to see their enemies clearly, to make sure their message was understood by anyone watching. This wouldn't be a subtle assassination. It would be a public demonstration of what happened to people who crossed Ezra Blackwood. "How many do you count?" Lenora asked softly from her position at the east window. She held Doc Webb's old hunting rifle, and though she'd never fired it in anger, she'd proven to be a natural shot during their practice sessions. 12 riders on the main approach," Jude replied, studying the distant figures through his field glasses. "Maybe more in reserve, staying back out of sight." The men Doc Webb had summoned had begun arriving 2 days earlier. 7 veterans in total, ranging in age from 30 to 50, all carrying the particular watchfulness that marked men who'd seen too much fighting. They'd positioned themselves in the barn, the tool shed, and behind carefully constructed barriers around the ranch yard. It wasn't an army, but it was enough. Maybe. "Tom Harwick's leading them," Jude observed, recognizing the lean figure at the head of the approaching column. "That's good. He's careful, professional. He'll try to talk first." "Is that better or worse for us?" "Better. Gives us time to see what they really want, what they're willing to do." Jude set down the field glasses and checked his rifle one more. Time. And it gives the witnesses time to reach Santa Fe. That had been their secondary objective, buying time for the women from Sarah's journal to reach the territorial capital safely. Mary Catherine O'Brien and Rebecca Walsh were already there, under federal protection. 3 others were traveling under escort, due to arrive within days. If Jude and Lenora could delay Blackwood's retaliation long enough, the grand jury would have the testimony it needed to move forward. The riders approached slowly, deliberately, making no effort at concealment. It was a show of force, designed to intimidate through sheer numbers and confidence. But Jude had learned during the war that sometimes a show of force revealed more about your enemy's weaknesses than his strengths. Why so many men for one rancher? And one woman, he murmured, more to himself than to Lenora. Because they're scared, she replied, understanding immediately. They wouldn't need 12 armed men if they thought we were helpless. The column halted about 200 yards from the house, just out of effective rifle range. Tom Harwick spurred his horse forward alone, stopping when he reached the fence line that marked the edge of Jude's property. "Colter!" he called out. "We need to talk." Jude stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. Behind him, he could sense rather than see his allies taking their positions, barrels appearing at windows and doorways like the spines of some defensive creature. "I'm listening, Tom. Mr. Blackwood's got a proposition for you. Might be we can settle this without anyone getting hurt." "What kind of proposition?" Harwick reached into his vest and pulled out a thick envelope. "Deed transfer and bill of sale. Mr. Blackwood's prepared to buy your ranch for fair market value. You and the woman can leave the territory with enough money to start over somewhere else." Jude felt a bitter smile, tugging at his lips. Even now, Blackwood was trying to make this about business, about transactions and legal documents, as if the systematic abuse of women could be resolved with a real estate deal. "And in return," Jude called back, "you forget whatever wild stories you might have heard. The woman drops her accusations. Everyone goes their separate ways. No hard feelings." "What if I'm not interested in selling?" Harwick's voice took on a harder edge. "Then Mr. Blackwood's prepared to use other means of persuasion. He's got writs and warrants, legal papers that say you're harboring a fugitive. Sheriff's deputies, ready to enforce the law." "What sheriff?" Jude asked. "Last I heard, Dalton was relieved of duty. New sheriff, appointed this morning. Man who understands how things work in this territory." It was exactly what they'd expected. Blackwood using his influence to install a puppet lawman, someone who would legitimize whatever violence followed. But Judge Hartwell had anticipated this move, and his instructions to Deputy Morrison had been clear. "Tom!" Morrison's voice called out from the barn. "Deputy Morrison here. I'm acting sheriff until the territorial investigation concludes. Any warrants you've got, you better show them to me first." The sound of Morrison's voice seemed to ripple through Blackwood's men like a stone thrown into still water. They'd expected to find an isolated rancher and a helpless woman, not an organized defense with legal backing. Harwick turned in his saddle to look back at his men, and Jude could see him reassessing the situation. This wasn't going to be the simple intimidation they'd planned. "Morrison," Harwick called back, "you're out of your jurisdiction. This is county business." "Federal investigation trumps county authority," Morrison replied. "You want to serve warrants? You go through proper channels." Jude watched the exchange with growing satisfaction. The legal maneuvering was buying them time, forcing Blackwood's men to either retreat or reveal their true intentions. Either way, it was a victory of sorts. But Tom Harwick was nobody's fool. After a few more minutes of shouted legal arguments, he raised his hand for silence. "Colter," he called out one final time, "Mr. Blackwood wants you to know that this is your last chance. Take the money and leave, or face the consequences. Tell Mr. Blackwood he can take his money and his threats." "And go to hell," Jude replied. "Your choice." Harwick wheeled his horse around and rode back to rejoin his men. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The two forces faced each other across the open ground like armies pausing before a battle. Jude could feel the tension building, the way it always did in those final moments before violence erupted. Then one of Blackwood's men made a crucial mistake. Thinking himself unobserved, he began working his way around the ranch's southern flank, clearly intending to get behind the defenders. It was exactly the kind of tactical error that Jude's field manual warned against: underestimating your enemies. Awareness and preparation. Southwest corner, Jude called out quietly, knowing his voice would carry to his allies. One rider trying to flank us. The response was immediate and professional. Jack Morrison, Doc Webb's nephew, not the deputy, appeared from behind the tool shed with his rifle trained on the flanking rider. "That's far enough, friend," Jack called out. "Turn around and rejoin your friends." The rider's horse shied and reared as he realized he'd been spotted. For a moment, it looked like he might comply with the order. Then, perhaps thinking he could still salvage the situation, he went for his gun. Jack Morrison's rifle cracked once, a clean shot that took the man out of his saddle without killing him. But it was the signal both sides had been waiting for. "Take cover!" Jude shouted, and the carefully rehearsed plan went into action. His allies disappeared behind their prepared positions as Blackwood's men spurred their horses toward the ranch buildings. But instead of a helpless target, they found themselves riding into a well-planned crossfire. The barn erupted with rifle fire, covering the main approach. The tool shed and outbuildings added their voices to the chorus, creating overlapping fields. A fire that turned the ranch yard into a killing ground. And from the house itself, Jude and Lenora added precise, aimed shots that forced the attackers to seek cover rather than press their assault. It was over in less than 10 minutes. When the shooting stopped, 3 of Blackwood's men were down, 1 dead, 2 wounded. The rest had retreated to the safety of a low ridge, dragging their casualties with them. Tom Harwick's voice could be heard shouting orders, trying to regroup his scattered force. "Anyone hurt on our side?" Jude called out. "Bullet crease on my arm," came Jake Patterson's voice from the barn. "Nothing serious." "Minor nick here," added Morrison from the tool shed. "These boys aren't as good as they think they are." Jude allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The first phase of the battle had gone exactly as planned. They demonstrated that the ranch was too well defended for a frontal assault, forcing Blackwood's men to either retreat or try a different approach. But he knew this was far from over. Harwick was too experienced to be defeated by one failed attack, and Blackwood had too much at stake to give up easily. They would regroup, reassess, and try again. "Lenora," he said quietly, "time to send the signal." She nodded and moved to the window that faced toward town. Using the mirror they'd positioned there for this purpose, she began flashing reflected sunlight in a predetermined pattern. 3 long flashes, 3 short, 3 long. The international distress signal, visible to anyone with the right equipment and knowledge. Within minutes, they saw an answering flash from the church steeple in town. Doc Webb had stationed a man there with instructions to alert the territorial authorities if violence erupted at the ranch. Help was coming, but it would take time to arrive. The question was whether they could hold out long enough for it to matter, as, if reading his thoughts, Tom Harwick's voice carried across the distance between them. "Colter, you've made your point, but this is far from over. Mr. Blackwood's got resources you can't imagine. He can wait longer than you can." Jude stepped back onto the porch, his rifle ready, but not aimed directly at the distant riders. "Tom," he called back, "tell Mr. Blackwood something for me. Tell him that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes. Tell him that some people can't be bought, threatened, or broken." "Noble words," Harwick replied, "but words don't stop bullets, and bullets don't care about noble causes." "Maybe not," Jude answered, "but sometimes a man's got to stand up for what's right, regardless of the odds." It was a declaration of war in the most formal sense, a public statement that this conflict would continue until one side or the other was completely defeated. There would be no more negotiations, no more attempts at compromise. The die was cast, and everyone involved understood exactly what that meant. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert landscape, both sides settled in for a siege that would test everything they believed about courage, conviction, and the price of justice in an unforgiving land. Lenora's testimony was written in careful, precise handwriting on sheets of paper she'd saved from her father's store. Good quality writing paper that would survive handling and time. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the besieged ranch house, she put the finishing touches on what might be the most important document of her life. "Listen to this," she said to Jude, who was keeping watch at the front window. "I, Lenora Vale, being of sound mind and under oath before God, do hereby testify to the following acts of criminal conspiracy and abuse perpetrated by Ezra Blackwood and his associates." She read the entire statement aloud, 7 pages detailing not just her own experience, but everything they'd documented about the systematic abuse of mail-order brides, the forged contracts, the corruption of local law enforcement, and the broader conspiracy to defraud and exploit vulnerable women. "It's perfect," Jude said when she finished. "Clear, detailed, impossible to dismiss as the ravings of a bitter woman. That's the point. Whatever happens here today, this testimony needs to survive." She carefully folded the papers and sealed them in an oiled leather pouch. "Even if we don't," the siege had settled into an uneasy pattern over the past several hours. Blackwood's men controlled the high ground, but couldn't advance without taking heavy casualties. Jude's defenders held the ranch buildings, but were effectively trapped. Both sides were waiting for something to break the stalemate. That something arrived just after 3 o'clock in the form of a lone rider approaching from the east. Tom Harwick met the man halfway between the ridge and the ranch, and even at a distance, Jude could see the urgency of their conversation. "Reinforcements?" suggested Jack Morrison from his position in the barn. "Maybe," Jude replied, studying the new arrival through his field glasses. "But the body language is wrong. Looks more like bad news." He was proven right when Harwick spurred his horse toward the ranch house, riding alone with a white bandana tied to his rifle barrel. "Colter," he called out as he approached. "Need to parley. Something's changed." Jude stepped onto the porch, his rifle ready but lowered. "What's changed, Tom?" "Federal marshals just rode into town. 3 of them, with warrants for Mr. Blackwood's arrest." Harwick's usual confidence was noticeably shaken. "Seems your grand jury moved faster than anyone expected." Jude felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. "What's that got to do with us, Mr. Blackwood wants to make a deal. He's willing to drop all charges, forget the contracts, even pay compensation to the women who were wronged." Harwick's voice carried a note of desperation. "All he wants in return is safe passage out of the territory." "And what makes him think we have any say in whether he gets safe passage? Because those federal marshals are going to want to talk to you and Miss Vale. Your testimony could be the difference between Blackwood facing a few years in prison or hanging for conspiracy and attempted murder." Lenora appeared in the doorway beside Jude, her written testimony still clutched in her hands. "Mr. Harwick," she called out, "are you suggesting we help a criminal escape justice in exchange for money?" "I'm suggesting you might want to consider whether revenge is worth more to you than your lives," Harwick shot back. "Because if those marshals arrest Mr. Blackwood, his associates aren't going to just disappear. They'll spend the rest of their lives hunting down everyone who testified against him." It was a sobering thought, and one that Jude had been wrestling with since the morning's battle began. Even if they won this fight, even if Blackwood was arrested and convicted, there would always be men loyal to him who might seek revenge. But as he looked at Lenora, saw the determination in her face and the carefully written testimony in her hands, he knew there was only one answer they could give. "Tom," he called back, "you tell Mr. Blackwood that justice isn't for sale, not for any price." "Then you're both fools." Harwick's composure finally cracked. "You think those marshals can protect you forever? You think hiding behind federal badges makes you safe? We think doing the right thing is worth the risk," Lenora replied firmly. Harwick stared at them for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "So be it, but don't say you weren't warned." He wheeled his horse around and rode back toward his men, and Jude could see him gesturing angrily as he rejoined them. Whatever restraint Blackwood's money and influence had provided was about to disappear. They're going to make one last try. Jude told his defenders, everything they've got right at us, make every shot count, but the attack when it came wasn't what any of them expected. Instead of another frontal assault, Blackwood's men split into 3 groups. One created a diversion on the north side of the ranch, drawing defensive fire, while the other 2 moved to surround the buildings completely. It was a professional maneuver, the kind of tactic that required coordination and experience. They've got military leadership, observed Jake Patterson from the barn. Someone who knows what he's doing. That someone proved to be a man Jude didn't recognize, a stranger with the bearing of a cavalry officer and the cold eyes of someone who killed for money. He directed the assault with hand signals and whistle commands, keeping his men spread, out and moving, never presenting a concentrated target. The defenders found themselves fighting on 3 fronts simultaneously, their carefully planned fields of fire disrupted by the attackers' mobility. Worse, the assault was clearly designed to drive them back into the ranch house, concentrating all the defenders in one location. They're trying to pin us down for something, Jude realized. This isn't about overrunning our positions, it's about keeping us in place. The answer came in the form of smoke rising from the barn. One of the attackers had managed to get close enough to set fire to the hay stored there, and the flames were spreading quickly through the dry timber. "Barn's on fire!" Jack Morrison called out as he and his partner abandoned their position. "Can't hold it!" Within minutes, the tool shed was also burning. The attackers were using fire as a weapon, systematically destroying the outlying buildings and forcing the defenders to retreat to the house. "This is it," Jude told Lenora as they watched their carefully prepared defenses go up in smoke. "They're going to try to burn us out or force us into the open. Then we make our stand here," she replied, checking the loads in her rifle. The final assault came just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that matched the flames consuming the ranch buildings. Blackwood's men advanced on foot now, using the smoke and confusion to mask their approach. But they hadn't counted on the determination of people who truly had nothing left to lose. The defenders of the ranch house fought with the desperation of the cornered, making every bullet count, every position costly to take. Jude found himself back in familiar territory, the kind of close-quarters combat that had marked the worst. Battles of the war. Men shouting, guns blazing, the smell of powder smoke and burning wood filling the air. But this time, he wasn't fighting for abstractions like union or states' rights. He was fighting for the woman beside him, for the justice they'd sworn to uphold, for the simple right to live free from the whims of powerful men. The turning point came when Lenora did something that surprised everyone, including herself. As the attackers pressed closer to the house, threatening to overrun their position, she suddenly stood up from her position at the window and began reading from her written testimony in a voice that carried clearly across the battlefield. "I, Lenora Vale, do hereby testify that on the 15th day of July, 1887, I was subjected to attempted murder by persons acting under the direction of Ezra Blackwood." Her voice cut through the chaos like a bell, clear and strong and utterly fearless. The attackers, confused by this unexpected development, actually paused in their assault. "I further testify that this attack was part of a systematic campaign of abuse and intimidation directed against women who refused to submit to illegal servitude." "Lenora," Jude called out, "get down!" But she continued reading, her voice growing stronger with each word. "These crimes were committed with the knowledge and participation of corrupt law enforcement officials, including Sheriff Dalton and his deputies." It was then that the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them, not more of Blackwood's men, but the federal marshals riding hard from town with a full posse behind them. The smoke from the burning buildings had been visible for miles, drawing them like a beacon. The effect on the attackers was immediate and decisive. Faced with the prospect of fighting federal officers while witnesses testified to their crimes, they began a fighting retreat that quickly became a rout. Tom Harwick was among the last to withdraw, pausing only long enough to shout one final warning. "This isn't over, Colter, not by a long shot, but it was over, at least for now." As the federal marshals secured the area and began rounding up the surviving attackers, Jude and Lenora stood among the ruins of their ranch and surveyed what they'd won. The buildings were mostly destroyed, the cattle scattered, the carefully tended improvements reduced to ash and memory. By any practical measure, they'd lost everything, but Lenora still held her written testimony intact and ready to be presented to the grand jury. Sarah's journal had survived, along with all the evidence they'd gathered of Blackwood's crimes, and most importantly, they were alive to tell their story. Was it worth it? Jude asked, as they watched the marshals lead away the last of their attackers. Lenora looked down at the papers in her hands, then out at the desert landscape where the first stars were beginning to appear. "Ask me again when the trial's over," she said, "when all those women have had their day in court, when justice has finally been done, and if Blackwood escapes, if his money and influence find a way to corrupt the system one more time." She turned to face him, and in the lamplight, from the house, he could see the steel in her eyes that had first attracted him to her. "Then we'll start over and we'll fight again, because some battles are worth fighting, no matter how many times you have to fight them." As they stood together in the ruins of what had been their home, Jude realized that they'd won something more valuable than buildings or cattle or land. They'd won the right to choose their own destiny, to stand up for their beliefs, to face the future with dignity and purpose. It was more than many people ever achieved in a lifetime. And for now, it was enough. The wedding bands were simple gold circles, fashioned by the territorial capital's only jeweler from metal that Jude had carried in his pocket for 3 months. He'd bought the gold with the last of his savings the day after the grand jury handed down their indictments, knowing even then that he wanted to ask Lenora to marry him, but waiting for the right moment to arrive. That moment came on a crisp October morning, 6 weeks after the trial ended, and justice had finally been served. They stood in the ruins of what had been their kitchen, surrounded by the charred timbers and broken stones that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. "The foundation's still solid," Jude said, kicking at a blackened beam that had once supported the roof. "We could rebuild here if you wanted." "Do you want to?" Lenora asked, studying the destruction with the practical eye she brought to all problems. "Start over in the same place where so much happened?" It was a fair question. The ranch held memories both precious and painful. The quiet evenings they'd spent reading by the fire, the morning he'd carved her comb, the terror and triumph of their final battle against Blackwood's forces. Some people might have wanted to leave it all behind, to find someplace untouched by violence and fear. But Jude had been thinking about it for weeks, ever since the jury foreman had stood up in that Santa Fe courtroom and pronounced Ezra Blackwood guilty on 17 counts of conspiracy, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. He'd been thinking about what it meant to claim a place, to put down roots, to say that this piece of earth belonged to him, not because he could pay for it, but because he was willing to fight for it. "I want to rebuild," he said finally. "Not because we have to, but because we choose to. Because this place represents something now, the idea that ordinary people can stand up to powerful bullies and win." Lenora nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the outline of where their kitchen table had stood. "Then we rebuild, but we do it right this time. Bigger house, better barn, room for the children we might have someday." Children. The word hung in the air between them like a promise, like a declaration of faith in the future. They talked around the subject during the long weeks of testimony and trials, but neither had been willing to make concrete plans while so much remained uncertain. Now, with Blackwood and 6 of his associates serving long prison sentences, with the corrupt sheriff and judge removed from office, with the systematic abuse of mail-order brides exposed and ended, they could finally think beyond mere survival. "Lenora," Jude said, pulling the small leather pouch from his pocket, I've been carrying these around for 3 months, waiting for the right time to ask you something." She watched as he opened the pouch and poured the 2 gold rings into his. In palm, they caught the morning sunlight, simple and perfect and full of possibility. "I know we've never talked about it properly," he continued, his voice suddenly nervous in a way it hadn't been even during the worst of the fighting. "I know we've been through hell together, and maybe that's not the best foundation for a marriage. But I also know that I can't imagine facing the future without you beside me." "Jude," she started to say, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. I'm not offering you much. A burned-out ranch, a man with more scars than money, and the certainty that we'll always have enemies who remember what we did to Blackwood." He took a deep breath. "But I'm offering you everything I have. Everything. I am. And the promise that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the rings in his outstretched palm. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "Do you remember what you said the day you cut me down from that cross? You said sometimes saving another. Soul saves your own." She looked up at him, and he saw tears in her eyes. "You saved my life that day, Jude Colter. But more than that, you saved my faith in the possibility that good men still existed in this world." She reached out and took one of the rings from his hand. "So yes, I'll marry you, not because I owe you anything, but because I choose you. Because you're the kind of man who fights for what's right, even when it costs him everything." They exchanged rings there among the ruins, with no preacher or witnesses, except the desert wind and the endless sky. It wasn't a legal ceremony. That would come later, in the town church, with Doc Webb giving the bride away and half the territory in attendance. But it was the moment that mattered. The promise they made to each other in the place where they'd learned what they were truly made of. Later that afternoon, as they sat on the porch of the small cabin they'd built as temporary shelter, Deputy Morrison, now Sheriff Morrison, elected in a landslide after the corruption was exposed, stopped by with news from the territorial capital. "Judge Hartwell wanted me to give you this," he said, handing Lenora an official-looking envelope. "And to tell you that the territorial legislature has passed new laws protecting mail-order brides and other vulnerable women. They're calling them the Vale Protection Acts." Lenora opened the envelope and found a formal letter of commendation, signed by the territorial governor and the Chief Justice of the Territorial Supreme Court. It praised her courage in exposing the Blackwood conspiracy and officially recognized her contribution to the cause of justice. "They want to name a town after you," Morrison continued with a grin. "Little settlement about 50 miles north of here. Vote was unanimous. The citizens want to call it Vale in honor of what you did." "A town named after me?" Lenora looked stunned. "But I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Jude said quietly. "You did what anyone should have done. There's a difference." As Sheriff Morrison prepared to leave, he paused to deliver one final piece of news. "Oh, and Sarah Mitchell asked me to give you this." He handed Lenora a letter sealed with wax. "She's getting married next month. Fellow named Henderson, son of the boarding house owner who protected her that night. Says she wants you and Jude to stand up with them at the wedding." After Morrison left, they opened Sarah's letter and read it together by lamplight. It was full of joy and gratitude, describing her engagement to a good man who loved her for who she was, not what someone else expected her to be. She was teaching school now, she wrote, using the reading and writing skills that had once made her a target to help children build better futures. "Listen to this," Lenora said, reading from the letter. "I wake up every morning grateful that you had the courage to stand up when standing up seemed impossible. Because of you, I'm not afraid anymore. Because of you, I know that justice is real, even when it takes time to arrive." As autumn turned to winter, they began the work of rebuilding, not just the ranch, but their lives together. The new house rose from the ashes of the old, larger and more solid, with windows that faced in all directions and a foundation built to last. The barn followed, Then the corrals and outbuildings, each one planned and constructed with the lessons they'd learned from both triumph and disaster. The cattle came back gradually, some of the original herd finding their way home, others purchased with money that arrived from unexpected sources. The women who had testified in the Blackwood trial had collected funds from across the territory, calling it justice money, intended to help Jude and Lenora rebuild what they'd lost in the fight for truth. By spring, the ranch was not just restored, but improved. The gardens Lenora planted flourished in the desert soil, fed by a new well that tapped into water sources Doc Webb's geological survey had identified. The cattle grew fat on grass that seemed greener than before, as if the land itself had been, renewed by the justice that had been done upon it. On their official wedding day in June, exactly 1 year after Jude had found Lenora tied to that cross, the little church in town overflowed with well-wishers. Sarah Mitchell was there with her new husband, along with the other women who had testified in the trial. Judge Hartwell had made the journey from Santa Fe, as had 2 of the federal marshals who had helped bring Blackwood to justice. But the moment that meant the most to both of them came during the reception, when an elderly woman approached them, with tears in her eyes. "I'm Mary O'Sullivan," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My granddaughter was one of the girls who disappeared years ago, before you exposed what was happening. We never knew what became of her, never got justice for what was done." She pressed a small package into Lenora's hands. "This was hers, a locket our family brought from Ireland. I want you to have it as a reminder that justice doesn't just serve the living. Sometimes it serves the memory of those who can't speak for themselves anymore." That night, as they sat on the porch of their new home and watched the stars come out over the desert, Jude and Lenora talked about the future. The ranch was thriving. Their love had proven strong enough to survive the worst that life could throw at them, and the territory was a safer place because of their courage. "Do you ever regret it?" Jude asked, turning the Irish locket over in his hands. "All the pain and fear and uncertainty we went through?" "Never," Lenora replied without hesitation. "Not for a single moment. Even knowing what it cost us? Especially knowing what it cost us." She leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm and utterly present. "Because I know what we accomplished, not just for ourselves, but for every woman who came after us, for every person who saw that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win." In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the desert, carrying travelers to destinations unknown. But Jude and Lenora were exactly where they belonged, in their own home, on their own land, surrounded by the community they had helped to make more just and safe. The cross where he had found her was long gone, burned in the fire that had consumed the old ranch. But sometimes, in the quiet moments of evening, they would look toward the spot where it had stood and remember the moment their lives had changed forever. Not the moment of pain and abandonment that had brought her there, but the moment of choice that had led him to cut her down. The moment when mercy had triumphed over indifference, when love had proven stronger than hate, when 2 broken people had found in each other the strength to heal not just themselves, but their entire world. It was a story worth telling, a legacy worth leaving, a life worth living. And as they sat together under the vast desert sky, surrounded by the peace they had fought so hard to achieve, they knew that some endings were really just beginnings in disguise. The best was yet to come.